In March 22, 1945, on the eastern bank of the Rhine River near the quiet German town of Oppenheim, a senior engineering officer attached to the German First Army stood in the freezing darkness and listened to the water. The Rhine is not merely a river. It is a violent, fast-moving torrent of glacial meltwater and deep currents stretching nearly 1,000 feet across. To the German military, and indeed to the German psychological identity, Vater Rhein, Father Rhine, was the ultimate, impenetrable fortress. It had stopped the Roman legions. It had guarded the German heartland for centuries. Earlier that week, the retreating elements of German Army Group G had successfully detonated every major bridge spanning the river in the southern sector. As the massive steel trusses collapsed into the dark water, the German High Command breathed a collective, momentary sigh of relief. According to every recognized textbook of military science, a major river crossing against an entrenched enemy of over 500,000 surviving soldiers is the most complex, perilous operation in warfare. It requires a massive logistical pause. It requires weeks of stockpiling pontoon bridges, amassing artillery, establishing air superiority, and rehearsing infantry. The German engineering officer looked across the black water toward the western bank, and the vanguard of the United States Third Army had just arrived there hours ago. The German officer calculated the math. The Americans would have to stop. They would have to wait for their heavy bridging units. They would have to bombard the eastern shore for at least a week before attempting a crossing. The river guaranteed the Third Reich the one commodity they were completely out of: time and campaign. Before we explore the terrifying moment the German High Command realized their sacred river had been breached in the middle of the night, we want to know who is keeping this history alive. The story of the Second World War is built on the sheer audacity of ordinary men asked to perform the impossible. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. And if you believe the true history of the U.S. Armed Forces needs to be told without Hollywood embellishments, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And to understand the profound psychological shock the German defenders experienced over the next 24 hours, you have to understand what they were listening to on their radios. 200 miles to the north, and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing to cross the Rhine. Montgomery represented everything the German military understood about conventional warfare. He was methodical. He was cautious. He had amassed over 1 million men and stockpiled millions of tons of supplies, and was preparing to drop 2 million artillery shells on the German positions before even putting a single boat in the water. The Germans could hear the buildup. They could track the logistics. It was a massive and predictable set-piece battle that German doctrine was perfectly designed to comprehend. General Paul Hauser, commanding German Army Group G in the south, expected the American forces opposite his sector to behave exactly the same way. The Third Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton, had just completed a blistering, violent armor rush through the Palatinate region, capturing nearly 100,000 German prisoners in a matter of weeks. By all rules of war, Patton's tanks were exhausted. His men were out of breath. The logic of war dictated that Patton had to halt at the river, wait for Eisenhower's approval, and mirror Montgomery's massive logistical buildup. But the German generals were applying the logic of conventional warfare to an enemy commander who viewed operational pauses as a tactical sin. Patton despised the idea of giving the enemy time to dig in. He understood a fundamental psychological truth about the German army. They were brilliant at organized defense, but they paralyzed when their rigid timetables were disrupted. On the western bank of the Rhine, Patton did not call a halt. He did not ask for a week of artillery bombardment. He did not wait for massive airborne drops or elaborate smoke screens. He looked at the 5th Infantry Division and ordered them to cross the river immediately on the run, using whatever assault boats they could scrape together at 10 p.m. On the night of March 22nd, the German sentries patrolling the eastern bank at Oppenheim were relaxed. The night was pitch black. There was no pre-invasion artillery barrage. There were no dive bombers screaming out of the sky. The silence was absolute. In the German tactical manual, an amphibious assault is always preceded by a deafening, earth-shattering bombardment to suppress the defenders. Because there was no bombardment, and the German sentries logically concluded there was no assault, they were wrong, slipping into the freezing, treacherous currents of the Rhine were hundreds of American infantrymen of the 11th Infantry Regiment, 5th Infantry Division. They were in small and fragile assault boats. They were not using heavy motorized craft that would announce their arrival. They were using wooden paddles. They paddled in total, terrifying silence across 1,000 feet of black water. And the first American boots touched the mud of the eastern bank, the German sentries were completely caught off guard. A handful of scattered shots rang out in the dark, followed by the brutal close-quarters sounds of trench knives and bayonets. And the German defensive outposts were overrun before they could even crank their field telephones to alert headquarters. By midnight, an entire American battalion was across the Rhine. By dawn, without a single heavy artillery shell being fired in preparation, the United States Army had shattered the final natural barrier of the Third Reich. When the reports reached the German command bunkers the next morning, the reaction was not just panic. It was a deep, paralyzing bewilderment, and the German officers could not process the information. How could an army arrive at a major river obstacle, and instead of pausing to build a logistical foundation, simply throw their men into the water in the dark? And the German High Command had placed 500,000 men along the Rhine, confident that the river itself was their greatest weapon. They believed they were fighting a mechanized army that was hopelessly tethered to its heavy supply lines. What they discovered on the morning of March 23rd was that the American soldier did not need a textbook, a massive bridge, or a week of preparation to break into Germany. All they needed was a wooden paddle and the cover of darkness, March 23, 1945. At 5:30 a.m., the freezing fog that blanketed the Rhine River began to thin, revealing the gray, churning water to the German artillery observers positioned on the high ground east of Oppenheim. The German officers of Army Group G were frantic, and the reports from the night before were incomprehensible. American infantry had crossed the sacred river in wooden paddle boats without a single round of preparatory artillery. The German observers pressed their binoculars to their eyes, desperate to understand the scale of the breach. According to German military doctrine, the American infantry holding the eastern bank should have been isolated, terrified, and clinging to a fragile perimeter. A river crossing was only the first step, and sustaining that crossing was considered the true impossibility. But as the morning sun broke through the mist, the German officers looking down at the river did not see a desperate, stranded vanguard. They saw a terrifying, mechanized hive of industrial fury. The United States Army was not digging in. They were building in the Wehrmacht. Bridging a major obstacle like the Rhine was a highly orchestrated theatrical event. It required specialized pioneer battalions, days of meticulous surveying, the perfect alignment of the banks, and absolute, undisputed control of the airspace. It was an operation of precision and caution. What the Germans witnessed on the morning of March 23rd possessed absolutely no caution. It was the brutal, mass-produced application of Detroit assembly line mechanics applied directly to a combat zone. The men of the U.S. 204th and 1303rd Engineer Combat Battalions did not wait for the bridgehead to be fully secured. They backed massive 6x6 cargo trucks directly to the edge of the muddy water. They were not surveying the river. They were simply shoving massive rubber pontoons and prefabricated steel treadways straight into the freezing current. General Paul Hauser, realizing that the American infantry on the eastern bank was about to be reinforced by heavy armor, ordered an immediate, desperate counterattack. He directed every available German artillery battery to zero in on the crossing site. Furthermore, in a rare appearance for the late stages of the war, the Luftwaffe scrambled Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter bombers to destroy the bridge before it could be completed. At 8:00 a.m., the German artillery found its range. Heavy 88mm and 105mm shells began to shatter the surface of the Rhine. Plumes of freezing water and razor-sharp shrapnel tore through the construction site. German fighter planes shrieked out of the low clouds, and strafing the American engineers who were chest-deep in the glacial meltwater. The German artillery observers watched closely, expecting the American construction to immediately cease. And a German pioneer battalion came under heavy fire during an engineering operation. Standard protocol dictated that the men abandon the equipment and seek cover until the artillery could be suppressed. You cannot build a heavy pontoon bridge while you are being actively bombed. It requires too much coordination, too much exposed labor, and too much precision. But the Americans did not take cover. To the absolute horror of the German observers, the American combat engineers simply ignored the barrage. When a German artillery shell scored a direct hit on a rubber pontoon, tearing it to shreds, the Americans did not retreat. A diesel-powered bulldozer roared forward, shoved the smoking and ruined pontoon out of the alignment, and another truck immediately backed up to drop a fresh one into the water. The American engineers, many of them bleeding, freezing, and exhausted, continued to bolt heavy steel treadways together, while geysers of high-explosive water erupted just yards away. They were acting with the terrifying, single-minded focus of factory workers trying to meet a production quota and completely unbothered by the fact that the factory was exploding around them. A German infantry captain captured later that afternoon recounted the psychological devastation of watching the American engineers work. "We fired everything we had at the river," he told his interrogators. "We hit their boats, we hit their men, but the bridge just kept growing. It crawled across the water like a mechanical serpent. And we realized then that we were not fighting a conventional army. We were fighting a mobile construction corporation that happened to be armed with high explosives." By late afternoon, the impossible had been achieved. A German high command had calculated that bridging the Rhine would require a minimum of several weeks of logistical preparation and days of construction. The American combat engineers, under direct artillery fire and aerial bombardment, built a 1-0-foot heavy treadway bridge capable of supporting 30-ton tanks in under 10 hours. As the sun began to set, on March 23rd, the German defenders heard a sound that signaled the absolute, undeniable end of the Third Reich. It was not the sound of paddle boats. It was the deep, guttural, synchronized roar of hundreds of Ford and Chrysler V8 tank engines. Lieutenant General George S. Patton had not just crossed the Rhine. He had paved it. Elements of the 4th Armored Division began rolling across the steel treadways, their tracks clanking heavily against the metal, completely ignoring the sporadic German artillery fire that was still falling around them. And the German officers who witnessed the crossing did not write about American tactical genius in their diaries that night. They wrote about American arrogance. The United States Army had looked at the greatest natural fortress in Western Europe, a river that had defined German military security for thousands of years, and they had treated it as nothing more than a minor logistical inconvenience. March 24, 1945. The sun rose over the eastern bank of the Rhine, illuminating a nightmare scenario for the German High Command. General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had just been appointed Commander-in-Chief West, received the morning dispatches in his underground bunker. The reports were not merely bad, they defied the fundamental laws of military physics. In classical German defensive doctrine, if an enemy establishes a bridgehead across a major river, the defenders must instantly counterattack to contain it. You build a steel ring around the beachhead and slowly crush it before the enemy can deploy their heavy armor. But Kesselring's maps showed that the American bridgehead at Oppenheim was not being contained. It was exploding. Lieutenant General George S. Patton had pushed the entire 4th Armored Division across the newly constructed treadway bridge. And once on the eastern bank, the American tanks did not stop to consolidate their position. They did not wait for their flanks to be secured by the infantry. They simply pressed the accelerators to the floorboards and drove straight into the heart of the German homeland. For the surviving German commanders on the ground, witnessing the American armor rush was a deeply traumatic psychological event. And the Germans had invented the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. In 1940, panzer commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel had shocked the world by bypassing strongpoints and driving relentlessly deep into enemy territory. Now, in the spring of 1945, the German officers watched helplessly as the United States Army took the German invention, scaled it up with terrifying industrial efficiency, and used it to rip the Third Reich to pieces. The German defensive strategy completely dissolved. A German Volksgrenadier battalion attempted to establish a roadblock in a village, the American armor did not slow down to engage in a methodical firefight. The lead Sherman tanks simply called an immediate and devastating artillery fire on the village using their radios, bypassed the flaming wreckage entirely, and kept driving. A German staff officer attached to Army Group G, who was captured near the city of Frankfurt just days later, and provided a haunting assessment to his American interrogators. He described the absolute terror of trying to fight an enemy that simply refused to stop moving. "We were completely paralyzed," the officer confessed. In the German army, an armored thrust of that speed would eventually run out of fuel. We would wait for the spearhead to outrun its supply lines, and then we would cut it off. But your tanks never ran out of fuel. We watched your armor advance for 50 miles in a single day, and right behind the tanks, keeping perfect pace, were hundreds of fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and mobile repair crews. You did not just send an armored spearhead, as you brought the entire logistical weight of the United States across the river with you. That was the terrifying reality that broke the spirit of the 500,000 German soldiers attempting to defend the Rhine. And they realized that their defensive lines were obsolete. They were fighting a 19th century war of trenches and roadblocks against a 20th century industrialized behemoth that simply drove around them. Entire German divisions found themselves instantly surrounded, not because they had been outfought in a set-piece battle, but because the American armor had driven 30 miles past them in a single afternoon. The German communication networks collapsed, and field commanders could not reach their superiors because the American tanks had already overrun the command posts located deep in the rear. General Kesselring, a hardened veteran who had orchestrated brilliant, stubborn defenses in Italy, is forced to admit that the situation was totally unsalvageable. The Rhine River, the mythological fortress of the German people, had been breached without a single day of preparatory bombardment, and the resulting armor rush was tearing the interior of Germany apart. On March 24th, Winston Churchill stood on the banks of the Rhine. General Patton, in a gesture of ultimate, calculated disrespect to the myth of German invincibility, and famously walked to the center of the pontoon bridge and urinated into the sacred waters of the Vater Rhein. But the true humiliation of the German military was not Patton's gesture. It was the mathematics of their defeat. They had spent years constructing the Siegfried Line. They had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men in the freezing forests of the Ardennes to protect the homeland. They had placed 500,000 soldiers along the banks of the Rhine, confident that their tactical superiority and the treacherous waters would bleed the Americans dry. Instead, the United States Army treated the Rhine not as an impenetrable fortress, but as a minor speed bump. In less than 48 hours, he had paddled across it in the dark, built a bridge under direct fire, and unleashed an armored apocalypse that the Wehrmacht was fundamentally powerless to stop. When the German generals sat in their cells after the war, analyzing how the thousand-year Reich had fallen so quickly, they did not point to a specific tactical failure on the Rhine. They pointed to the sheer, terrifying audacity of the American military machine. They had realized far too late that you cannot fight an enemy who ignores the rules of military science, who builds bridges while you are bombing them, and who treats the greatest natural barrier in Europe as nothing more than a starting line.